though the Mona Lisa may be the most famous artwork in the world, I would argue this bit of painting would be a close second. You've got to check this out. Support provided by the Glick Fund, a CICF fund focused on inspiring philanthropy. Additional support provided by the Crystal DeHaan Family Foundation in honor of the children and families of Crystal House. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni, we'll just call him Michelangelo, was born March 6, 1475 in Caprice, Italy.
Buongiorno, whatever.
Yeah, he wasn't always the happiest artist, but we'll get back to that later. Michelangelo had 4 brothers, and his father was a magistrate, and his mother stayed at home with the kids. Now, when Michelangelo was an infant, she became pretty sick. In fact, Michelangelo ended up having to have a wet nurse, so he ended up living with a family of stonecutters. Interestingly, Michelangelo said it was because of this stonecutter wet nurse that he drank in the hammer and chisel. Yeah, not too sure about that one. By the way, did you know Michelangelo didn't want to be known as a painter? In fact, he would probably be insulted if you first referred to him as a painter and not a sculptor.
Seriously, you did not just refer to me as painter, did you?
Like many 16-year-olds, Michelangelo didn't really care for school, so he often would skip class and head to a nearby church to watch the painters. His family detested art and felt like he was a disgrace to the family. It was definitely not a suitable profession for a man. I think once Michelangelo started to make a name for himself as an artist, he loved to remind everybody back home. You can tell since he would always sign his letters home with Michelangelo, sculptor in Rome.
That's right, and don't you forget about it.
After realizing that Michelangelo had some artistic talent, his dad encouraged him to find an apprenticeship where he could learn more about art. He went from a painter's workshop to then studying within a powerful, rich, elite family within Florence, the Medici family. Did I mention they were the rulers of Florence? Yeah, they were. Working with this family gave him special privileges. One of those was being able to study dead bodies at the church waiting to be buried. This fueled his passion to understand human anatomy, and unfortunately, the stench and nastiness of the experience started to make him sick. Enough of that. Just a few short years later, when Michelangelo was only 25 years old, it was apparent he had a black belt in sculpture. After relocating to Rome, one of the cardinals within the Catholic Church commissioned him to create a sculpture. Michelangelo, being pretty cocky at this time, said,
"It will be the most beautiful work in marble Rome has ever seen."
A bit confident, right? Actually, it's this sculpture, La Pieta. Have you ever seen this one before? You bet you have. Check it out. Michelangelo sculpted this from a single piece of marble stone. What amazes me is it only took him 1 year to complete this 6-foot by 6-foot sculpture. Have any idea what the title means? Well, Pieta simply means pity or compassion, which makes sense considering the subject being Christ and his mother Mary. So you're probably asking yourself, what makes this sculpture so incredible? Let me explain. Check out the details in the folds and the ribs and muscles on the body. All this movement these details create. Trying to sculpt these details was incredibly hard. And trust me, people knew it, which is why many pilgrims would come to Rome just to see this sculpture. After returning to Rome, he hears about a sculpture that 2 other artists had abandoned because it was too difficult. Fueled with confidence from La Pieta, he takes over the job. David took 3 years to sculpt. After Michelangelo finishes this sculpture, his fame starts to build. In fact, word got around to the Pope, Pope Julius II. Immediately, Pope Julius commissions Michelangelo to create his tomb. This was huge for Michelangelo, especially since all he wanted to do was sculpt. And designing the tomb for the Pope was a huge honor. Michelangelo is so pumped to get going, he starts gathering a team, pouring the stone needed, and working out his idea. Of course, right in the middle of this, the Pope turns his attention and funding to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, which was falling apart. You have to keep in mind that Rome has basically turned into a cow pasture at this point. And the Pope wants to return Rome back to its powerful roots. A very Renaissance idea, I might add. Needless to say, he is super frustrated with the Pope. And when he wouldn't pay Michelangelo back for the stone he bought, he heads back to Florence, vowing never to return to Rome. That is until the Pope sends him a request. Have any idea what he's about to ask him to do? That's right, grab your paintbrush and get back to Rome and paint the Sistine Chapel. Let me tell you his response to the Pope.
I do not wish to attend to anything about the tomb and not the painting.
Believe it or not, no one wanted to paint the Sistine Chapel. This wasn't just about the painting process. This also had to do with the chapel itself. Let me school you for a minute. The Sistine Chapel was built in 1477 and was designed to the same biblical proportions as the Temple of Solomon, which made it a fortress. The walls at the base are 10 feet thick, arrow slits added around the outside, and they even added special holes to pour boiling oil out of. Pretty crazy. I bet you didn't know this, but the chapel had been painted before by a team of artists with 32 popes painted around the room, and then a blue field of stars was added to the ceiling. However, not even 21 years after the construction, cracks start to appear in the vault. To stop this from getting worse, in 1504, they placed huge iron rods underneath the floor. Of course, now we have a major problem. The ceiling and the walls must be repaired. After putting some of the Pope's muscle on Michelangelo, he told him he could only work on the tomb if he painted the Sistine Chapel. He reluctantly agrees. On May 10th, 1508, work begins, and man, what a job Michelangelo has in store. Let me just shortlist some of the crazy issues he will have to face.
Man, that's really high.
1. He has to remove all the old plaster within the chapel, which was going to be a huge mess. 2. The chapel was not going to close while Michelangelo was painting, so normal scaffolding covering the chapel floor wasn't going to work. 3, it's Rome, and it can easily get to 90 degrees in the summer, and that's just standing outside on the ground. 4, Michelangelo is painting in fresco style, which he had very little experience with, and is one of the most difficult forms of painting ever. 5, the height within the chapel was crazy. The ceiling was over 60 feet above the ground. That's over 6 stories tall. First priority was to build some sort of scaffold or a platform. Michelangelo hires the top dog scaffold builder in Rome, and he decides to hang the scaffold from massive ropes. This did not fly with Michelangelo, who immediately tosses out the idea. Michelangelo then decides to drill holes on either side of the chapel walls. Then he takes planks and inserts them into the wall, which then allowed the scaffold builder a base to start from. Michelangelo's idea was to create 2 arches with steps that contoured and curved with the ceiling. This design was ingenious and left the floor of the chapel clear for the Pope. However, they knew debris and dust would be an issue, so they hung a massive fabric under the platform. This solved another issue, which was blocking the dizzying 60-foot drop from the scaffold. Probably most important to Michelangelo, this prevented anyone from seeing the work until it was completed. After removing the old plaster, things were about to get started. But fresco painting needs 2 layers of plaster on the wall. The first is called the arricchio, and the second, which is called the intonaco. We will investigate further into this within another episode, simply because there is so much sweet science happening here. If you are about to throw down 150 different scenes using one of the most difficult painting techniques known to man, you are going to need a team of assistants. After much deliberation, he finally decides on 4 assistants, and man, he was going to need them. Let's just quickly run through what an average day 60 feet above the ground looked like for Team Michelangelo.
Man, that's really high.
First, the entire team had to climb the 40-foot ladder to the lowest planks. That's over 3 times the average swimming pool depth of 12 feet, just in case you were wondering. Once up, they had to climb steps to reach the additional 20 feet to the top. Light came in through small windows by day, but it was torches only at night, and yes, they worked at night. Next, they would apply the intonaco layer. Mixing this paste was no easy task, and also pretty dangerous. Keep in mind, one of the primary ingredients was quicklime. Know what else they used quicklime for? They would sprinkle it on dead bodies to quicken the decomposition and lessen the stench in the church courtyard, where the dead would wait to be buried. powerful stuff. The next step would be for the artist to transfer the cartoon to the wall. This was basically a drawing done in graphite, which was usually transferred by poking hundreds of holes around the sketch, and then using powdered charcoal to transfer the lines to the wet plaster. Again, crazy time-consuming and difficult process. Of course, all his paints had to be hand-mixed as well. Mixing these pigments was an art in and of itself. The team Michelangelo was having is that mildew was forming on the plaster. His team was adding too much water too quickly to the plaster mixture, and they were also adding binding agents or glues to help adhere the paint. However, this wasn't allowing the plaster to dry quickly enough. Mildew, not good. So what does Michelangelo do? He fires almost his entire team and decides to paint buon fresco, which means to paint directly on wet plaster. Michelangelo may have lied down here and there, but more often than not, you would have seen Michelangelo painting standing up with his head turned up. Seriously, can you imagine how painful this would get after days, weeks, months, and even years of doing this? My neck just hurts thinking about it. By the end of October in 1512, he finally sends a passionate, in-depth letter to Florence stating,
I have finished the chapel. I have been painting.
seriously, 4 years, all that work, all that paint, all that neck pain, and that's all he says? This guy just cracks me up. Anyway, on October 31st, 1512, on the eve of All Saints, the Pope hosts this banquet in the Vatican. His goal was to end the evening with his 17 cardinals seeing the finished chapel. But of course, the Pope drags this evening out with a long dinner, a couple of different comedies in the theater, and even a nap. Finally, at sunset, he and his buddies head to the Sistine Chapel. I imagine the group making their way through the dark corridors and hallways lit only by torches as they follow the smell of fresh plaster and paint.